Hi everyone, Dennis Monokroussos here with another of our weekly installments. As promised, we're going to finally take a look at my game from the last round of the 17th North American FIDE Invitational. I'm black and my opponent was Rogelio Antonio, who's a grandmaster from the Philippines. And I needed to win in this game to get my IM norm. And let's see how it went. Okay, so e4, e5, bishop c4. This was kind of a surprise for me. But happily, I suppose, it's a line that I've played a few times and have also faced in the past. So I'm fairly up on the theory, or at least on I don't know all the theory, but I know what it is that I want to play with black. There are a lot of ways to play this. Knight f6 is probably the main line, or the mainest of the main lines. If you play like this, though, then you have to know this Yurosov gambit with d4. So I typically prefer to just sidestep that with knight to c6 on move 2 and give my opponent the opportunity to transpose back into an Italian game if he so desires. But he stuck to the Vienna approach with knight c3. It's fine. Knight f6, d3. And, okay, here black can play bishop to c5 or bishop to b4. I prefer the latter. I think this is a much clearer path to equality. Knight g to e2, d5. Takes, castles, bishop to e6. And here my opponent played a move that I didn't expect. The two main moves here are knight to e4, after which black drops the bishop back to e7 to prevent knight to g5. And okay, and then here white has a variety of continuations, knight 2 to g3. I think f4 is supposed to be an inaccuracy here, but I think maybe bishop to b3 can be played and then f4. At any rate, this is an alternative approach. The other main approach here is, and maybe it's the main line, or the foremost of the main lines, is bishop takes d5, and then after bishop takes d5 to play f4 straight away. And white would like to use this pawn as a battering ram here to wreck black's king side. But I think black is okay after simply castles, f5, and then f6. Alright. Also, I think bishop takes c3 has been played here before. The point being that after black is going to play f6, it might seem at least unclear if that bishop is going to have a great long-term future. So here, white usually takes with the pawn, and again, now f6. And alright, knight to g3, queen d7, or king h8, and so on. So it's an interesting line, and both sides can play these positions with confidence that they're in a position that's roughly equal and offers chances for both sides. Okay, well anyway, going back to the game, my opponent didn't choose either of these approaches, but played something a bit different, bishop to b5. And this move was some cause for concern. On the one hand, he's wasting some tempi. I mean, the bishop went to c4, it's gone to b5, and the point, of course, is to take on c6. So, from that standpoint, it's terrific for me. On the other hand, once he takes on c6, if I simply allow him to do so at a time when I can't recapture with a piece, then I'm really, well, I'm going to have a ruined structure on the queen side, and that's clearly a concern. So what should I do here? You know, this is a good position to kind of test your intuition here and try to figure out what to play. Well, the answer is that I think black can play the move queen to d7. I think about this, I just didn't like that I was essentially tying my pieces down somewhat. So I decided, I felt that I hadn't done anything really wrong, and that given my advantage in space in the center and the tempi that white's expending with this plan, and also the fact that it's not the main plan. So that too was a bit of an encouragement, that if this plan was such a strong one, then it would be more popular than it in fact is. So I decided, with some trepidation, simply to castle here. Okay, of course white is consistent. He takes, I take, and now knight e4. Oh, I should say one other thing that I wanted to point out that I think is important, and it's that while my queenside structure is quite bad and can cost me, in fact, in the game much later it becomes a factor. On the other hand, it's on his majority side. So doubled pawns and let's say a bad structure in general is not as bad if it's being used for purely defensive purposes. So I do have this kind of quasi-central majority, more space in the center and a king-side majority of sorts. So that side of the board, on that side of the board, my structure is undamaged. So that also offered me some hope. In addition, the c-file is closed, and he doesn't have a light-squared bishop anymore, and his queen isn't bothering my c-pawns yet either. So while, again, down the road, this could become a serious worry, for the foreseeable future, my structure shouldn't be too much of a problem. Okay, so back to the game. After knight to e4, once again, the idea is to drop this knight into g5 in some cases. Also, in some positions, black will have to worry about the move f4 from white as well. So anyway, here I played bishop to e7, stopping that. And of course, my bishop has nothing to do on b4 any longer anyway, so this repositioning move is quite sensible. And now Antonio played b3. And here it becomes clear what he's up to. So again, it's just a very positional, structurally oriented plan. He'd like to put the bishop on b2, maybe swing this knight to c4. Also, there could be the possibility of playing d4 to open this diagonal and open the center, at which point my c-pawns will become a problem. So I definitely have to do something here. If I just play passively in this position, bad things are going to happen to me. So as committal as it is, I go for it. So f5, knight to d2. All right, but okay, I say I'm going for it, but what exactly is it that I'm going to do? I mean, a move like f4 here, for instance, while it looks aggressive, there's also, or there should be a part of you that feels kind of queasy making this move too, in light of the permanent weakness of e4 especially, and also maybe f3. So it's certainly very committal. I played bishop to d6. Okay, he plays bishop to b2. And, okay, of course, by this point I already decided what I was going to do, but again, I have to act kind of quickly. I mean, he's going to play knight to c4. If I play queen to f6, then I'm walking into all sorts of pins here with f4, or again, well, no, d4 won't be very good there probably, but f4 could be. Also, just putting a rook on the e-file and moving the knight from e2 out of the way is going to offer white tremendous pressure against my pawn on e5. And if that falls for nothing, then the game is just over. So here I have to find some way of making some kind of counterplay. I have to find some way of activating my pieces and making them do something more interesting than protecting the pawn on e5. So, not a bad place to kind of stop the recording and figure out what in the world it is that black ought to do. All right. Well, as you may have guessed, I did play f4 here. And okay, what's white to do here? If he plays the immediate knight to e4, of course, this is kind of asking for trouble, as I'll play f3 and start to crack him open here on the king side. So knight e4 would be a pretty weak move. He could try bringing the knight back to f3 to blockade that pawn and to take aim at the pawn on e5. Here, if I play bishop to g4, he shouldn't take. I mean, if he takes, then I'm going to get f3 in. So if knight takes e5, I'll probably play bishop takes e5, and then f3. Actually, yeah, okay, I don't have any tricks on the e-file, I don't think, but taking an f3 looks like it should be unpleasant for him. Also, maybe even queen to g5, followed by bishop to f3. So the right move here after bishop to g4 is knight to c3. And here, it's roughly equal. Maybe white's got a slight advantage. Instead of bishop to g4, though, queen to e8 I think is very strong. Again, taking the pawn on e5 would be very, very dangerous for white. But if he doesn't, I'm just going to build up. Queen g6 or queen h5. Bishop comes to g4 or to h3 if my queen's on g6 perhaps. And I'm definitely getting play. And my rook can lift up. Excuse me. My rook can lift up and over as well. And I'm getting a lot of pieces into play. Furthermore, should white ever choose to take on e5, then there's the danger that when this pawn goes, then my bishop will also be part of the attacking force. So you can see that white has to be extremely careful in a position like this, that he doesn't just get overwhelmed. And taking the pawn on e5 here, right now it's actually his friend, because it keeps my bishop on d6 out of the game. Okay, well Antonio didn't play knight to f3, but chose instead c4. And this is a pretty sensible idea. For one thing, now when his knight on e2 moves, let's say I play f3, my knight will no longer have access to f4, which is a square I'd really like to put it on. So, okay. The other point is that if I bring my knight to f6 or to e7, then it blocks my queen's path to g5 or to h4. Also, maybe, let's see, if knight f6, knight f3, if I play knight to g4, maybe he just plays h3. Maybe e4 can be played. Maybe this is alright. So I'm not sure what to think about this. Takes, probably queen d4. Yeah, this doesn't look good for me. And if I play something like knight to d7, well, okay. I've put some pieces on pretty passive squares. I think then maybe he plays knight c3 and knight to e4 with pretty good play. I mean, I'll still have some pressure. So actually, this still isn't really completely clear. So here, okay, queen e8. All right, this could still be interesting. All right, so knight to d7. Another idea might be c5, but here, yeah, I think this is probably bad because I'll have the f3 shot again. So here, let's say bishop takes e5, takes, f3, and if he takes here, then I can probably just play knight takes d3. I don't think rook takes f3 has got anything going for it, but okay, maybe I can play this way. I mean, it feels a little bit slow, but perhaps knight to d7 isn't so bad. Just have to be a little patient, but my pieces will make a return trip to the land of the living soon enough. All right, one other idea. d4, e4, knight e5, and let's say f3. Knight g3. Queen h4. Okay. Certainly have some play here too. So okay, maybe this is a viable idea. All right. Maybe I could play that. In any case, I chose knight to b4. So a more aggressive move, but also a more committal move. Now, there are two ideas behind this. At least two ideas. Well, okay, three ideas total. The first idea is the last one I was just thinking of, but one that I mentioned before, which is to keep the path for my queen open. Okay, so that's the one basic point. Of course, I'm also threatening to take this pawn on d3, but there's a third positional idea behind it, which is if I'm given time, I'd like to play c5, knight c6, knight d4. And I think if I can achieve that, then I'm actually in pretty fair shape. Not great shape. Well, no, I can't even say that. I think I am in decent shape at that point. I think my pawn weaknesses are no longer significant. And while my bishop on d6 looks like a big pawn, in fact, it does a great job of holding the whole structure together. And meanwhile, I keep the advantages on the king side that I've already accrued. So knight to b4, I think, is a promising approach. And for this reason, knight f3 is more or less forced, not giving me time to play c5. All right. So here, I played bishop to g4, but bishop f5 may actually be pretty good, just counterattacking the pawn on d3. If he takes, okay, if he plays, yeah, all right, if he plays knight c1, that's fine. And if he takes, I take, and now I throw in f3. And capturing, of course, would be a very poor idea. So knight f4 is probably best. And now after we exchange some pieces, I think black has reasonable chances. Opposite colored bishops here will favor me, at any rate, if I can whip up an attack. On the other hand, all of my bad pawns mean that if the attack doesn't work, then I can have some problems. But again, I think the position is roughly equal here, and this is entirely playable for black. Okay, but I played more straightforwardly with bishop to g4. And Antonio played a3. And now I made a couple of obvious moves here. I took on f3. He took. I played queen g5 check, king h1, and queen h5. Now, the threat is pretty obvious. I want to take on f3 and bring my rook up and over and kill him. Excuse me. And, okay, let's try to figure out what can be done here. Now, white has, okay, at least maybe 3 moves that are worth considering, and I looked at 2 of them. One, which is the move that he played, I completely missed. Though, as it turns out, it's not actually a very good move. Okay, the move that he had planned, and that we both found a refutation for, I had seen it first, he came to see it later. Although, funny enough, we both were inaccurate in the same way in our calculation of that line. So he saw the right idea, but miscalculated it. Okay, so what Antonio had originally intended to play was simply knight to g1. And what he missed, what I saw, and what he ended up seeing as well, is that I can play rook to f6, and now I'm winning. So we thought, okay, a takes b4, rook to g6, and then black simply follows up with queen to g5, mate, game over. And if he tries knight to e2 here, of course, that's hopeless, because queen takes f3 is mate. And even if it wasn't, rook to h6 would be mating. However, white has knight h3. And there's just nothing for black to do to win here. Queen takes h3. I can't put my queen on the g file. And now he simply plays rook to g1. And alright, I've got a little advantage still, but nothing too serious, just an edge. So the right way to do it in this position is rook h6 first. So this is the key. Forcing h3, and now rook to g6. There's no longer knight h3 to be dealt with, and so then the queen goes to g5 and queen g2, and it's forced mate. All white can do to even delay it is play something stupid like rook takes a7, just a spite sacrifice to increase the move count. Unfortunately, this did not happen. Also, the move that didn't happen is a takes b4. Certainly, you should wonder what happens after this. Okay, queen takes f3, king g1, rook f5. Of course, I want to play rook to g5 check, but because white has an extra piece at the moment, he can make moves like knight to g3. Not only returning it, but trapping my queen. Not that he's going to win my queen, but it forces the exchange. So f takes g3, queen f3, rook f3, takes, and we just have this mutual pawn massacre situation. And after we've had our fill of pawns here, the position is about equal. In fact, it's pretty close to dead equal, but okay, maybe not quite dead, but it is equal here, and a draw would be the expected result. So, okay. You know, I didn't have any guaranteed win or anything, but he would have at least had to have played accurately to hold the balance in the position. But, okay, he plays Okay, so in this position, since there's only a draw, it doesn't look like there's any way to win. Started wondering if there was something better earlier in the game. Okay, so after queen g5, king h1, there's something better than queen h5, I don't believe. However, instead of queen to g5, the immediate, well, not the immediate, because I didn't go to h4, but playing queen h4, immediately putting my queen on the h file, is in fact very dangerous. I consider this move almost subliminally. Tate afterwards suggested it too, and I think it's quite dangerous and probably is the best move in this position. All right, well here White has, I think, at least 3 defensive tries, and I would encourage you to stop the recording here and do your best to analyze them for yourself. So I've spent quite a bit of time working them out on my own, checked it with a computer afterward, and generally speaking, my analysis was pretty good. I think there were some improvements relatively far into the lines, but I did better than I had feared that I would going into it. All right, well, I'll assume that this is sometime later and you've worked it out. And the 3 candidate moves here that seem to me probably exhaustive here of the reasonable white tries are king to h1, preparing rook g1, rook g2, king to g2 straight away with the idea of rook to h1, and then finally just grabbing the knight and making black prove it. So let's start with that. A takes b4. Okay, rook to f6 with the by now familiar idea of rook to h6, maybe rook to g6 followed by rook to h6 in some lines. Okay, rook to e1 trying to run away. And now rook h6 anyway. The point that white can't really run away with king to f1, hoping for queen takes h2 when knight to g1 or knight c3 should be perfectly adequate. But instead, of course, queen to h3 check. So we drag him back, and after king g1, now we check, and we have this kind of funny little seesaw here. We drag him back to g1 again, and then mate on h1. So it's kind of fun. Queen goes from h4 to h3 to h2 to h3, and then to h1. All right. So king f1 is bad. Another try is knight to g3. Again, trying to buy black off, but this time it doesn't work. Queen h2. Now we take the knight. Queen takes g3, and black is a pawn up, but much more than being the pawn up, the attack is clearly going to be decisive in a hurry. I mean, this rook on h6 is coming to h2 or to h1. The rook goes to f8, and white's position is collapsing. Even bishop takes b4 can help out too when it cuts off this diagonal, and can also come back to c5 to cut off that diagonal. So no hope for white at all in that variation. Finally, there's knight to c3, clearing the path first. But queen h3, and now we've got the threat of rook to g6. And if the knight comes around in a circle here, it's just too much time, and as I mentioned before, my bishop's dreams are now fulfilled with e4. And black's attack is just starting to explode into white's position here, and the game will be over momentarily. Okay, so that's a takes b4. I think that just loses outright. No hope there. All right, let's look at king to g2. Okay, if queen to g5 check, this would transpose back to the game. Queen g5, queen h5, and so on. But rook f6. Okay, this is the right way to go. Okay, rook to g1, rook to g6 check. And this idea I think I maybe missed, or I saw this but wasn't really sure, because I was initially worried that it's king to f1 and didn't look at it as seriously as I should have, but simply queen to f3 check is actually too strong, because king e1, queen takes f3. The threat is to take on d3, of course, and the bad news for white is that if he takes here, bishop takes. If king to f1, then queen h3 check with mate next move. And if bishop to c3, then the knight on e2 is overloaded. And we just take, rook here, and nice knowing you to white. Okay, so white has to play king h1, but then it's okay. We can't mate because he has rook to h2, or rook to g2. So rook h6, rook g2 is not too bad for him. But queen f2, and this turns out to be okay for black. In fact, it's probably winning, despite the piece sack and also despite the fact that there's no immediate mate. So rook takes rook, h takes, a takes b4. Okay, if knight to g1, then queen b2. And black is at least clearly better and probably winning a couple of pawns up here. At least one pawn up. Well, no, it's two pawns up. Probably keeping both the bishops better than the knight. And so even though black's structure has some problems, white has an awful lot of weak pawns and maybe has problems like king f7 and rook to h8 to deal with in the future too. So not very attractive for white. So a takes b4, but now we just start taking things or taking more things. And black has 3 pawns for the piece. Dangerous attacking possibilities. I mean, you can see bishop to c5 is already almost crushing. Okay, so queen c2, rook f8, preparing to bring yet another piece into the attack. Rook f1, queen h3, c5. So this stops bishop to c5 and also threatens queen c4 check and queen takes b4. Okay, so king h7, we get out of the way. Knight c1, f3, queen f2, bishop c5, d4, rook f4. I mean, it's just one attacker after another. And okay, if he takes the bishop, rook to g4 check, followed by rook to g2. Actually, that might be okay too, but rook to g2 was the idea. And that just wins the game. Alright, so king h1 instead of taking. e4, again just disregarding the threat to the bishop because after d takes c5, there's e3. And white, well, the only way he can keep the rook and g2 both protected is with queen to g1. But, okay. Just trying to decide between e2, f2, and rook to g4. They all look so good. Alright, rook to g4. Yeah, that's way bad. So, no chances there. Alright, white has to try rook to g1 then. Okay, now we finally retreat the bishop with bishop to d6, and we prepare to take further aim at the h2 pawn with maybe rook to h4. So rook to g3, queen h5. Again, rook to h4 is threatened, so queen to g1, rook h4, game over. Okay, so that means that king to g2 here after queen h4 also fails. So does this mean that I would have had a decisive advantage with queen h4? Well, we still have the last move to look at, king to h1. And now it turns out not so easy to knock white's block off here. Alright, if I play queen to h5 again, that should transpose to the game, but no real reason for me to play like that. Okay, so let's look at rook to f5 with the idea, of course, of simply sliding the rook over. Alright, well now, two possibilities. Okay, if knight to g3, this is an attempt to show that my rook is maybe misplaced. If I play fg, fg, no problem, and he's stopping rook to h5. But maybe I can just play rook to f6, accept the loss of a tempo, and still go over. But it looks like after rook to g1, I basically have to take this. I can be clever here and play knight takes d3, and I should. The point being that after g takes h4, knight f2 check, and I regain the queen, and I've destroyed his structure. So queen takes d3, so I at least got the pawn out of it. Queen h5 here, and then this. And, alright, I mean, you can continue the analysis of this position, but it looks as if it ends up with rough equality here. I mean, white is basically consolidated on the king side. My weaknesses are not too serious, and with this, we basically end up in another position where it's going to be a big pawn swap, or both sides will have to kind of passively defend their own weaknesses. So, going back to here, after rook to f5, knight to g3 seems to equalize. He can also play rook to g1, and alright, now maybe I should play knight to a6, because if I play queen takes f2, he takes, and I don't really see a great follow-up here. So I mean, I have counterplay, I have compensation. I have 2 pawns and some space and some increasingly vague attacking prospects, but white is probably okay here. But on knight a6, I think white's also doing well after d4. And he seems to have everything covered, and I don't have anything better than just swapping off here. And now with my knight on a6 being especially stupid, white's a bit better. Okay, so going back to this position, I think rook to f5 is not really all that promising. Rook f6, though, I don't think is all that much better, as long as white plays rook to g1 here. So again, I take, he takes, check here, rook g6, queen f1, takes, and knight to g1. And although I've got 3 pawns for the piece, and on that level, or to that extent, I'm doing well, he's basically consolidated, and I'm in danger of actually his piece becoming more meaningful, more meaningful than my big swarm of pawns. I mean, most of them are pretty far back, so it's definitely still a very messy position, but objectively speaking, white is probably doing well here. So I think the best move, and ironically it's the most basic beginnerish move here, is just to play knight to a6 and keep the silly knight. So on the one hand, of course, my knight is kind of stupid on a6, and I no longer have any kind of tactical tricks that involve grabbing the d3 pawn. On the other hand, I'm simply saving my knight, and now I can get back with my attack without having to worry about this knight hanging. Also, I may have the chance to bring my knight back into a very nice position with knight to c5. And so if white stops it with b4, well, then I kind of got a free tempo too. So if he's spending tempo with that, well, I can get on with my business here. So rook to f5, he's got to play rook to g1, and now I can take the pawn and simply be a pawn up. It's not a big advantage because, again, I've got all these structural problems, and my bishop on d6 is kind of plugged up, and my knight on a6 is out of play. But, you know, his pieces aren't fantastic either, and his pawn on f3 is weak, and his king is a little bit vulnerable. So, okay, I mean, black is a little bit better here. Also, okay, if he plays instead knight to c3, being a little bit more materialistic, well, okay, I get knight to c5 in, and we've both gotten something out of this, but I think black is, again, ought to be happy with this position. So, it's there's no knockout, unfortunately. So this inspired me to go back even before this position here, before bishop takes f3, and to see if maybe I can improve further, because by playing bishop takes f3, then after g takes f3, it gives him these various options. So again, the king coming up and letting the rook come over, or again, king h1, rook g1, rook g2. So he's able to use this, able to use this g2 square, and I frankly rather he couldn't. So maybe what I should do here is not capture at all, but play the rook lift first. Okay, my queen can't go to g5 or h4, so I could play maybe queen to e8. That also could be considered. It's a bit slow though. So let's look at the rook lifts. Okay, so let's start with rook to f5 and see what happens if white plays a move like h3. Well, here, takes, queen h4, and actually, in fact, maybe he's holding. So plays king to h2, the knight comes back to g1, and okay, I'm not positive that he's holding, but maybe he is. Now, if you remember the position that we looked at before, that I mentioned that Antonio and I both saw, but we slightly miscalculated, if this rook were back on f6, then the knight to g1 idea would be nothing at all, because then I could play rook to g6 and queen g5. So there we have a little bit of an argument for rook to f6. Okay, but let's look at some other lines before we go back to that. So h3 may be just fine for white. Maybe not. Okay, next line, let's see what happens on the greedy move, a takes b4. So now, bishop f3, g takes f3, queen h4, knight g3. And again, I would really like to have my rook back on f6. Still, it's not so bad with rook to f6, but probably only equality. So king g2 is forced, and then rook h1. But now I check, I take, and I play e4. We saw a position earlier where this was just devastating for white. Here, though, it looks as if he's still in time. Queen f1. I retreat, and now rook a5. Hey, where did that guy come from? So white's getting to use his pieces from every angle now. And after these exchanges, and now bishop to c3, protecting the pawn on b4. Okay, so there's more tricks here. He can't take, of course, because f2 check is winning. He has to take the pawn, but then I'm up the exchange, and up a full exchange, and king g2, of course, loses to taking because I promote. So after I play bishop takes g3, he has more tactics. Bishop takes g7, and if I take on g7, then rook to g5 check. It's good for white. So rook to e8. More cleverness here, more fancy business, threatening rook to e1 mate. So he can't take my rook, he can't take my bishop, but if he just retreats his rook, it looks like the fun has come to an end, more or less. King takes, pawn takes, and we have, after all of the adventures, an equal ending. Still interesting. Can certainly still play this position out, but given the great weakness of my queen side, it looks like I'll probably have to be the one who does the saving. At any rate, it's very close, but looks like white just holds there. And actually, I should say that position just is equal. I mean, I don't really have to do too much to save it. Chances are pretty much balanced. Okay, so a takes b4 can be played too. So we saw h3 was okay, a takes b4 is okay, and let's look at even knight to e1. So rook to h5, f3, queen h4, and this looks very exciting too, but I think I'm only drawing in this position as well. Now, white should not try to play for a win with king to f3, because after e4 check, now my rook comes into the game as well, and that's just too much. But if he goes back to g1, I have nothing better than to repeat with queen h2. So the moral of the story here is that after a3, okay, bishop takes f3 was the move in the game, and rook to f5 is what we just looked at, and they're both, I think, well, neither is winning for me. Okay, but let's try instead rook to f6. We saw two lines where it would have been much better for the rook to be on f6, so maybe this is the winning move. Well, if we play h3, then it is. So takes, rook h6, and now again, if king to h2, queen h4, knight g1, we do the old switch back with rook to g6, knight e2, and now we don't go back and forth. So rook h6, he plays knight g1. If I play queen to g1 here, he plays rook to g1. But what I do instead is bring the last piece into the attack, rook to f8. Now, white has no good moves here, so let's just look at the main idea. A takes b4, rook f5, rook a7, and hopefully everyone sees at a glance what the winning move for black is. Right, it's this checkmate into queen h3, and then rook h5 mate. Okay, so that was what happens on king to g2. What happens on king to h2? So queen h4 and so on. If king to g2, it's more challenging, but still good for black in the long run. Queen g5 check, and here he's got to throw the knight away. Queen h4, rook h1, f takes g3, and now if f takes g3, simply rook to g6. So let's say a takes b4, rook g6, c5, check here, and now again we can be very flashy here with rook to f8. Okay, c takes d6, queen g3, threatening queen g2 check, and on king to e2, f1 queen is a very powerful double check. So king e2, rook takes d6, and now the threat is to take this one and then take this one. Queen f3, I mean the king can't go back to f1 because the rook hangs, and if it goes to d2, then we play rook takes on d3. So king d2, running in advance. Rook takes f3. King c2. So the king scrams all the way over. Rook f takes d3 here. Queen g6. And alright, this is just target practice stuff. I mean, it's the variations are fun, but it's clear that white is completely lost. And okay, this is just easy. Queen and 3 pawns for rook and a piece, and actually black's winning more pawns too, so no contest here. Alright, so this means that rook to f6 works like a charm after h3. Unfortunately, there was a reason why black tried rook to f5, and it's just that the e-pawn hangs. And I couldn't find anything here really good for black. And in a way, it's not surprising. I mean, with my center collapsing, and I've got the rook hanging and the knight hanging, it's tough. So, for example, bishop takes f3, bishop f6, queen f6, g takes, queen check, here, knight to d3. So I have some counterplay. My pieces are active, but I don't have enough of them. And unfortunately, that pawn on f4 is keeping my bishop on d6 from participating to the fullest extent. I'd like to play bishop to c5 next and hit this, so white should play b4 here, rook to d8, and now queen to b3. So getting out of the way, threatening c5 check. And so black has some compensation, but white's better. So bishop to e7, rook a to d1, bishop to h4, kind of taking the long way around here, c5, king f8, rook to d2, rook to d7, queen d1, just kind of piling up, and knight c1 is coming next. Maybe knight takes f4. No, not knight f4, because then I'll have queen g2 mate, but knight c1. So takes, bishop takes, queen takes, pawn check. And while after all of this, all the adventures, the material balance has been reestablished, still, funny enough, after all this time, it ends up being about my queenside pawn structure again. And so white has a genuine advantage here. In this whole line with the exchange down, I mean, black does have some compensation, but he's always kind of trying to catch up. It's never really white who's having to grapple to save himself, but it's black who's fighting for enough activity to stay afloat. So the upshot then is that after a3, my attempt to improve with either rook to f5 or rook to f6 weren't completely successful. So rook f6 just seems inadequate to bishop takes e5, and maybe knight takes e5 could be good as well. While rook to f5, the problem is that the rook is going to have to lose a tempo going back to f6 in some variations. Maybe there's something else, but it's just hard to see what it would be. I guess, well, again, it might be worth looking at knight to a6, though again, maybe maybe knight to a6 deserves further investigation because, bishop takes e5 just loses to bishop takes f3. And on knight takes e5, well, once again, takes f3 might be good for black. Although, knight's g3, I wonder about this. I kind of suspect that white is in reasonable shape here. So queen to e7. Which pawn? F pawn is worth considering, so that way the rook can lift up. So like f4, with the idea of maybe, well, not only knight to f5 being threatened, or knight to h5. Well, okay, either of those, and then rook comes to f3, and then g3 or h3. So this looks like it's pretty dangerous. But also, I mean, just the immediate. Well, no, okay, that's kind of forcing. So, yeah, not really any choice there. All right, so this is definitely interesting and merits some further consideration. But it's not going to get it right now. At any rate, bishop takes f3 was the game. G takes f3, queen g5, king h1, queen h5. And now, as I said, a takes b4 we looked at. And this is, if I recall correctly, about equal. Yeah, knight to g1 loses. And then there's the move that Antonio played, which is very interesting. I didn't see this at all. Knight to d4. And it's a pretty clever idea. Okay, well, I think there's still enough of interest in the game that I think I'll just stop at this point. So the game kind of changes character here pretty quickly and loses its middle game feel. So take a look at this. Maybe look at some of the other variations, and if you can find some interesting improvements on my analysis, that would be definitely a lot of fun, especially if it's an improvement for me. I'd like to see some place where I could have won, if there is such a place. If there is, though, I'm not sure what it is that he did wrong. So that would be, perhaps Black doesn't deserve to have a winning advantage. It's enough that it's a dangerous play that's at least good enough for the balance. At any rate, we'll stop here. Next week, maybe the week after, or probably next week, we'll finish this game up, and I'll be looking forward to seeing whatever analytical suggestions you have in the comments, or that you can send to me via the contact link on my blog. So I'll throw that little bit of advertising in, chessmind.powerblogs.com, so you can have a look there, and again, write me via the contact link if you've got some analytical suggestions. Okay, so in any case, thank you very much, and of course, have fun analyzing this position too. It's certainly an interesting one, and I will see you next week. So hope you had a Merry Christmas, and hope you will have a Happy New Year, and see you next time. Bye-bye.